Welcome to the BraveYard. Today's guest is an incredibly inspiring female entrepreneur and corporate guru. She has nicknames like the Turnaround Queen and the CEO Whisperer. She has just released 2 new books and has an upcoming TED Talk. Please give a warm welcome to the incredibly inspiring Victoria Pelletier. Hi, Victoria.
Hello. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for being here. I'm so excited. I mean, just doing like a deep dive into who you are as a person is like so inspiring on its own, but then also just listening to the way that you speak and how you just are so vulnerable, and then you talk about your journey with vulnerability, which I think is really interesting, is amazing. But let's just get started with how your holidays were, because I think when people listen to this, they'll be far gone. But for us, they just happened. How were your holidays?
They were great. I went on a cruise just before the holidays, which was nice. But it was also odd because both my kids were going to come for Christmas, and then they are both in the middle of moving, etc. So I didn't get to see them, but they'll be coming within the next couple of months.
Aww.
And I spent time with what I refer to as chosen family. Some really great friends. We hosted them over here for Christmas dinner, and then went out for New Year's. So it was fantastic. Thank you.
I
Hope yours was
love
great.
that. Chosen family is family, as all queer people know.
That's right.
Your kids are moving. If I'm not mistaken, they're in Canada. One of your sons was going to college and your other son lived with him. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So the older one went to college in Ottawa. They grew up in Toronto.
Right.
And the younger one graduated high school down here in Miami Beach, where we live. And then taking a gap year, moved in with our older son, although realized he was hating Ottawa. And so moved back to Toronto, wanted to be back in the big city.
Fair. I mean, I've been to Ottawa and I've spent some Christmases in Ottawa. And I mean, yeah, it's a beautiful city. I'll give it that. But I don't know if I'd want to live there full time ever in my life.
No. I'm born there. So it's weird. Like it's sort of full circle that at least my older one's there. The younger one, like I said, just to Toronto. But yeah, no, I'm way more of a big city girl and want lots of excitement. Even if I want to know it's there, even if I don't do it. I'm not a party girl.
Exactly.
And so,
it's just
Toronto, New York,
the comfortability of having it. It's like if I wanted to do something, I could, but I'm not going to.
That's right.
So I think my first question is, somebody very special to you calls you a turtle. And I was wondering if you'd explain why.
Yeah. My best friend, Jen, she nicknamed me Turtle forever ago. And it has to do with this extreme amount of resilience, nothing to do with my pace, because I'm like not slow at anything, I think. But the really tough exterior, I have the ability to shoulder and deal with a lot, having overcome significant adversity and trauma and obstacles. Yet inside, I'm really a marshmallow who cries at, Humane Society commercials. So that's where the nickname Turtle comes from. She and I both have it tattooed on the inside of our forearms.
Oh, that's so cute. I mean, I definitely cry at commercials. I think there was like a Canadian Tire commercial that I cried at recently, and I was like, maybe I should have my hormone levels checked. I'm just feeling really emotional. You talk about this hard exterior, and you've shared openly about how you were adopted from an abusive mother. Do you think that shell, so to speak, started around the time that your abuse started as well?
I think I think there are 2 things around my level of resilience. One, I think some has become learned. I've learned how to have a healthy way of, dealing with adversity. But the other is, I do think there was something innately in my DNA, fight or flight. I'm a fighter. And I think the early years with Julie, my biological mother, did cause me to be resilient. I mean, it was quite abusive. I was only there with her for 3.5 or so years, but had a cigarette on my eye, pushed upstairs, downstairs. So learned to be really tough just in dealing with like physical abuse. But it
3 years old and a cigarette in the eye.
That one was carelessness, but yes, versus intention. The others were all intentional.
Right.
That one was a moment of carelessness, but I wore a patch for months. And even today, my eye will droop when I'm tired as a result of it.
Right.
Um, but I think the emotional trauma that came with that was a big part of what hardened the shell, so to speak, from for years on from then.
Right. Wow. Um, you talked about how you were adopted by a mother's friend. Did your mom and that friend stay in touch? Like, did you have a relationship with your mother after you were adopted, or was
Not
that
not much. So, Julie met my mother in a bar. My mom was a journalist for Music Express, which is I described as like Canada's version of the Rolling Stone magazine, if you will. So my mom would be in bars to see bands, and so that's how they met. And then after some of these abusive episodes, Julie actually would give me to the people that later became my parents to like watch me as she cooled down, had some space. And after several of those instances, my mom approached her and said, "We'd like to take her, adopt her." And so, most selfless thing Julie could have ever done was agree to let me go. And after that, my mom moved to Western Canada. So I actually moved when I was 5 or 6, I think, to Calgary. And that was to create space from Julie, who was in the Ottawa, Montreal area. So go cross country. Julie would often call my mom. Sometimes it was for money, but to kind of check in on me. And then once she came for a visit, I think I was 6 or 7, and she hit me slapped me in front of my mom. My mom instantly kicked her out of the house. That was the last time I ever saw her.
wow? And
Mhm.
do you know where she is now? Have you spoken or
I so she landed herself in jail several years later for stabbing someone. Um,
Mm.
and interestingly, we'll talk about sort of, queerness and identity. She came out as a lesbian when she went to jail. And at that point I was like, well, I actually sort of almost went the opposite for a couple of years. And although I was really young, cause I'm like, I'm going to be nothing like her.
Yeah.
Um, and I chose never to be connected with her. She did get out, I don't know, after how many years. I did get connected to my biological grandmother and a couple of my biological aunts. And through my grandmother was trying to get me to see Julie. Julie ended up contracting AIDS or died from complications, drug use, sexual abuse. Who knows? Who knows?
Mhm.
And so my grandmother was really pushing me to go back to Ottawa to see her. And I felt at that point it was really just for Julie to make amends or do whatever. And I didn't have that need, nor at the time did I feel she deserved to have me there and allow her to say her piece. So I never
Absolutely.
saw her. I knew she saw pictures of me because even though I didn't want it, my grandmother shared photos with her and at that point I had at least my first son. She died when I was pregnant with my younger one, Jordan.
Right.
But so no, she'd seen pictures, but that was it. And I'm at peace with the decision that I made to not see her. I tried to ensure that I invited no negativity into my life, and I thought she would do that. So
And that's fair. I think we talk about our parents as queer people, and there's just such a like a push narrative that you should have relationships with family. And I think that it's really toxic in some ways because you're forcing people that a lot of the time can be abusive or unsupportive or mean or crude or whatever it is for people, and saying that this narrative that you should make an effort and try and have amends with family. And it's just for so many queer people, that's not really the case and how we exist. Do you think that there's a distance between yourself and how you kind of got that nickname and then the nickname of Iron Maiden? And do you think that that was part of your journey where you had to distance yourself from your emotions because of what happened with your mom?
I became like I was a tough, hardened kid. I remember my mom and I walking at one point. It probably was very shortly after she adopted me, and my hair. I was very strawberry blonde, ringlet curls. And someone, I was a construction worker, said, "Oh, aren't you the cutest little thing?" I don't know if I'm allowed to swear or not, but at 4,
Yeah, yeah, you can say whatever the
okay,
fuck you want.
okay, I was like, I turned to this guy. I'm like, "What the fuck are you looking at?"
Mhm.
From a 4-year-old, like and so my mom worked very hard to get me to understand where does that emotion come from? But it, I got very good at learning how to compartmentalize the emotions.
Mhm.
I mean, I continued to have, so I was always fearful of being rejected. I remember my mom saying to me at one point, she's like, like I'd done something, and she's like, Tori, we are not giving you away. So she needed to reinforce that I was safe, I was loved, and I would not be in the same situation as I had experienced with Julie. But I lived with that fear, rejection. But then things like, for me, I ended up being a gifted student. I mean, nature nurture.
Yeah,
I
you
don't know
skipped
some of the
grades, right?
right. I'm like, where did that come from? But from that to being like the tallest kid, I hit my height. I'm 5'8" by the time I was 10 or 11. So I was always the tallest kid and
Same.
ostracized.
I'm 6'1", but same.
And so ostracized for it. So even though I was beyond Julie in that abuse, I just continued to have all these things and people who were at me all the time. So I learned how to compartmentalize. And I was still a fighter. So I'm like, I'm not going to let what you say to me stop me. You've hurt me, and I'm just going to move forward. And so that's where I think the ability to shut it off, put the mask on, cry at home in private or with my partner later. But I'm not going to show it. I'm not going to show you that I'm vulnerable and that I have weak points, which aren't weak, but that's how I viewed it. And so that is where Iron Maiden, which was a nickname in the workplace, because I was very good delivering business results, made really tough business decisions, but no one ever saw the softer side of me because I was afraid and I wore that mask. That's exactly where it comes from. Like, I can point to the stuff in my past. And that's why I believe, like, we have to be talking about our lived experience. That's my why for now sharing so openly, because I want other people to know how they can break through on the other side.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's so important too, is like seeing the power in vulnerability. Speaking about like the nickname in the workplace of Iron Maiden, you were a COO. You were at 24 when you got the job. And I think watching you step into your vulnerability now, you have nicknames like the Turnaround Queen, the CEO Whisperer, and Unstoppable. And that clearly shows the power in vulnerability and the impact that it has of those around you. Switching gears a little bit onto how you've now gotten so many of these nicknames. You started working at 11. You were an assistant store manager of a shoe store by 14, and then were appointed COO of a company by 24. And you say in some interviews that your drive, as you've mentioned, is half DNA and the other half is making sure that you want to beat biology and circumstance. Do you mind explaining what beating the circumstance? I mean, beating biology, obviously we get it. We've heard about your mother and wanting to beat where you were, quote unquote, born from. But then you say you want to beat circumstance. And I feel like obviously that portrays to your adopted family.
Yeah. Although very loving family, from a socioeconomic standpoint, we were low middle class. I mean, I never had to worry about going without food or clothing, but that's the extent. We were in a rented townhouse that bordered on the worst neighborhood in town. I didn't get to go on vacations. My parents couldn't afford for me to go on like my school, the bigger field trips. I didn't go on my grad trip, those kinds of things. And that's why I started working at 11. Anything extra, I would have to, pay for. And so, that circumstance. My mom said to me, I think I was 11. She's like, Tori, you need to do better than us. My mom was a secretary. And actually for the first several years after we moved to Calgary, after they adopted me, she actually stayed at home, and babysat children so that she would be there for me. And then she went back to being a secretary, and my dad was a school janitor. And so she said, you need to do better than us. And she meant vocationally. She meant by education. And like, she didn't have to say that to me, because that's when I say I wanted to prove that and be better than biology or circumstance, or, in the family that I grew up in, the circumstance of the family that I grew up in. Like, that was what pushed me. So my definition of success back then was very different from how I view it now. It was about title and hierarchy and compensation in the workplace. Again, now it's very, very different, but that is in large part why I push myself to perform and go to higher and higher levels.
And you talk about the mask that you had that you would constantly show up to work wearing. Do you feel like the mask had anything at all to do with your queer identity, and then also being in like a mainly male-led workforce and being the only woman in there? Or was that more of just a mask for like emotional vulnerability?
It was both, for sure. It was like the lack of emotions was a result of the vulnerability that was rooted in my youth, and the fact that I was the only woman at the executive table, and I didn't want people to question me at being at the table, and I viewed emotion as softness or weakness, and I didn't want to give anyone a reason to question my seat at the table. And it was also around my identity. So when I stepped into that COO role at 24, I was the youngest by at least 2 decades. I was the only woman and the only queer person. I met my wife when I was 22, and I was also a brand new mother to our first child together. And so for me, like, I wore the mask too. Again, I don't love the phrase imposter syndrome, but it was a stretch role for me. I did know that. And I was the only woman, queer person, young person at the table. So the mask was to protect myself and, to some extent, at the time, I believed, secure my seat at the table.
Yeah, and I mean, I relate to that so much because I didn't have the best upbringing. Like, I did have a mother that loved me. She was a single parent, but fortunately there were just complications in her life and in my life. So I moved out when I was 15. And it was very much that same idea in my head of showing emotion is showing weakness. And you need to just be straight, direct, to the point, get everything done, have your results there. And I carried that into a lot of jobs, and I found success from that in some of those jobs because it was what they wanted at the time, was somebody that was just there to get results and not fuck around at the end of the day. And I think that not showing emotions in anywhere in my life, and then it was very much the same where I would go home and have my cry or talk about it with my partner or close friends. But it's hard to respect someone, I think, that you feel no human connection to. And as a leader, so when I stepped into leading roles, I think that's where I started to notice that being feared is not a way of leading. It's then you start looking at all of these things and where the psychology comes from behind that. But I had to really start unlearning everything that I thought about business and how to show up as a leader and start rewriting that script myself. And a lot of that meant I needed to go inwards and do a bunch of self work and try to figure out why I was so afraid to show emotion all the time.
Yeah, I am. And that was the journey I went on. Beyond the nickname, I will tell you, there's one other moment. I came in one Monday from the weekend and was talking to a colleague and about what we'd done. And I said my wife and I had watched some movie at the theater. And I said I was like profusely bawling and didn't have enough Kleenex. And I remember she just kind of looked at me and she's like, Vic, it's like, I thought you'd be the type of person who laughed at people who cried at movies. Like, I was so devoid of showing emotion that this is what she thought of me.
Mhm.
Like, that was the kick in the ass. I'm like, holy shit. Like, the Iron Maiden's one thing, but then to like hear that, and from it was a peer. It wasn't like a direct report even. I was just like, if I am showing up like this, it's all wrong. And so, like, to your point and what the journey you went into, I did have to look inwardly and spend a significant amount of time reflecting. And I knew where it came from and I knew why I was doing it, but it was still hard to change and to
Totally.
start
It's uncomfortable.
yeah, exactly. Do the things that are not innately the way you outwardly behave and make you feel uncomfortable every moment you're doing it.
Totally. And when you go up against abuse and neglect, like my dad was an addict in and out of my life, there was a lot of abuse there. I went through sexual abuse when I was younger. And even talking about those things for me, it was just like, nope, I'm not sharing my story. I'm not telling you anything that happened to me because it portrays weakness. And also, after coming out as trans, I didn't want to add to the narrative because it's like, oh, you're trans. There's like this weird toxic narrative around queer people and being sexually abused and like all this stuff. And I was like, I don't want to contribute to it. I don't want to be any part of this vulnerable space of sharing. I want to do my job. I want to do well and be closed because it's scary to let people in. And vulnerability is something that I think everyone just thinks you can either do or not. But for some people, like for myself, it was so uncomfortable learning how to be vulnerable and trust people, because when you're used to just doing everything for yourself and you're constantly fighting for yourself and making sure that you have you because nobody else has got you, it's not something easy to let people in and share things intimately about yourself that we have portrayed in our head as weakness in the past.
Yeah, agreed. And I don't know about you, but for me, it was not just the discomfort with sharing it because of being viewed as weak. I had a journey that I needed to work through around self-love, head and heart. And, this journey, this 18-inch difference here, say very different things. In my head, I know that Julie was on a very different journey in her addiction and the way my grandmother raised her, which I learned later and my grandma kind of apologized for. Like, I knew why she did what she did to me, but my heart couldn't help but be so pained around the fact that you could do that to a child, or the fact that none of my biological family chose to take me, right? That entire, my last name was Saxon. That Saxon family let me all go, right? Like that, but I wore that. And so again, my head knows one thing, but I question, am I lovable? Can I be loved? And I think I sought wrong kind of attention. So as much as, again, I know all of these things and it was afraid to be vulnerable, I still feel like I was just on this journey of not really loving myself. Again, I wore a mask and people would think I was so confident. And, but again, that was for show until I finally believed it. And that I needed to get the head and heart closer together to believing, the truth and loving who I was.
Totally. And how did you do that? What were some of the first steps that you took for anyone that's struggling with this right now? What advice do you have for them to be able to start working towards that path as well?
I didn't have professional therapy. I would encourage that for many. And I've had my children in it. My ex-wife passed away when they were 13 and 9, and they've been in therapy ever since. The youngest one ever since. The older one not all that time, just for the first few years. So I think that's incredibly valuable. I leaned heavily on skills my mom taught me around self-awareness and self-reflection, and a couple of close people in my life, my partners of my ex-wife and now husband, my best friend, and maybe one or two other confidants to kind of talk through it. But a lot of it also had to be this internal self-talk around you are valuable, you are worth it, you can be loved. It doesn't need to be physical. I actually manifested a lot of, I got a lot of attention from people from a sexual perspective. And so I equated that with love.
Totally. Yeah. I was guilty of that as well.
Step back at some point and to go, no, I am a lovable person. I am kind and loyal. And so I had to talk a lot and think. And so I spent a lot of time in my own head. The good news is I traveled extensively for work, so it gave me the opportunity to do that. To even now, it's just a practice I have, in that I work out all 6 days a week in the morning. That sets me up for the day. So I'm reflecting on day before, what's going on for the day, or if there's something bothering me. That's my space while I'm working out to work through that.
Right. I think it's going inwards is something that's just so scary. It's something I'm still doing today and trying to learn. And that's also part of being an entrepreneur. You should constantly be going inwards, trying to be a better version of yourself. And if you're in the corporate world and you're leading for the team that you're leading or for how you show up in your work, but going inwards it's terrifying. And that's the thing, is a lot of people don't want to do that work because it is scary. You have to sit down and think about things that hurt you and where it comes from and trauma, and try to navigate the emotional baggage that you've carried with you. Because for me, I realized I hadn't dealt with anything in 30 years of my life. I'd put on a backpack of 30 years of trauma and abuse and just really hurtful things that I, again, wanted to put on my brave face and say, I'm fine. I can look at the positive in everything. And the positive is I'm going this way. This is success. But you don't realize that you just have this constant backpack on, filled with all of this stuff that's weighing you down. And then it kind of seeps through into your everyday life slowly and slowly until eventually you have to sit down and be like, okay, like I need to go through this because in order to climb the next mountain of success, whatever that looks like for somebody, you need to have less weight. Like you're not going to be able to do it with that backpack. I don't know if that's a metaphor that resonates with you, but
Yeah.
it's something that I talk about a lot.
No, it's an interesting choice of metaphor because I have 2 books coming out in 2024. And the second one is around leadership. And I talk about my journey from Iron Maiden to Turtle and the analogy of like the turtle and the growth. But I talk about the weight of the backpack that I wore.
Oh, yes, it is. See, it's a thing. It just,
it is.
That's me and my best friend. She's very similar, I think, in the aspect that she's in the corporate world. I think you two would get along famously, but she is very much the brave face woman in a workforce filled with men. And she's learning now how to like go through vulnerability. And me and her, on our friend group and our family, have gone through a lot of loss in the last few years. Unexpectedly, we lost people that were really close to us. And me and her talk about the backpack all the time, but in terms of grief, and it's just like we can't, if we're having a day or something and we need each other, then it's just like, hey, like I need a day to go through my backpack with you. And it's just sometimes sitting there and being emotionally supportive to the other person because it sucks going through your trauma. Like, yes, there's a lot of it you have to do alone. And I'm not going to sit there and say that anyone else can help you do it because they can't. But sometimes doing it with somebody else and just having that confidant to be able to listen and love you in despite of all of these things that have happened and show you love and show you care, it's just that can be really rewarding. So I think utilizing a support system is really, really important as well.
I agree. It's the sticking on this metaphor. For me, it's just the unpacking of the backpack. I don't need you to put away what I've taken out of the backpack. So when I talk to Danny, my husband, I talk to Jen, my best friend, as the two who most frequently I'm unpacking with, it's just, I need to be heard. I need to let it out. And I may or may not ask for advice at all, but generally I don't. Just knowing I have the safe space to do it and release it is incredibly powerful.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Your favorite tags to use in a post are unstoppable and no excuses. And a quick quote that I thought I loved was you mentioned strategic intentionality. And I feel like that sums up clearly how you approach business. And I think similarly, that's how I try to approach business with that phrase now, especially in my mind. Do you think that that's a way that you go through your everyday life as well?
I do. So unstoppable and no excuses, 100%. I mean, that means there is nothing that is going to prevent me from achieving whatever goal or objective I've set for myself. And that no excuses is coupled with that. It just recognizes that shit's going to happen. Obstacles, adversity, something might create a bit of a sidestep, but you have a choice in terms of how you're going to respond to that. So it drives my children nuts that I use it with them as well around this no excuses. But so that piece, yes. And the strategic intentionality, I will tell you, so I'm incredibly strategic and intentional on a multitude of things, yet I do give myself the space to go with the flow to some extent. So I live in Miami Beach now. New York is one of my favorite cities in the world. And when I got relocated back to New York several years ago, I never thought I would be living, but came on vacation, fell in love with the house, decided I wasn't going to keep both properties, kind of here I am. And the virtual, like remote working, had allowed. So I give myself permission to follow. And I am not overly spiritual. I'm definitely not religious, but there's a little bit of this, whatever you cosmic current, I don't know what you call it, but I just allow myself to kind
the universe.
Yes.
Yeah.
The universe. And so although I have a plan all the time, I give myself permission and flexibility to adjust if I feel something drawing me towards another path.
Right. And I think that's kind of the beauty in life is when you think, well, there is a phrase that I think goes along with religion, but it's been spun now so many times where it's like you make plans and God laughs or and the spirits laugh or whatever. And it's very true because I think so many things that I do in my life, especially with business, I go into intentionally and then something happens and it completely changes. And then you're presented with a brand new set of options. And a lot of the times, the ones that have had the most meaning for me or propelled me forward or been the most valuable have been ones that came out of nowhere that I ended up jumping on. And I think a lot of people are afraid to take opportunities and allow change in their life because comfort is safe. And I've definitely been guilty of that. But when you relinquish some control and allow flexibility and then strategically utilize picking up on new opportunities, it can propel you forward in like a very momentous way compared
I,
to sticking to that same beaten path and just walking and keeping your head down and never really straying off to learn new things.
I agree. I think I've taken some very bold risks. When I took that first COO job, as I said earlier, I was a brand new mother and I worked for one of Canada's largest banks and felt security after being there for a number of years to leap from that environment that I knew to a very large stretch role in a smaller private company as a new mom. Like that was incredibly bold and risky.
Mhm.
But one, it had me, there was intention around the path I wanted to go towards in terms of moving into an executive level. And I'm a big believer that if you are not challenging yourself, the growth is not going to come. So have
Totally.
continued to put myself in that position. And that might be, ever since then, I've stayed in B2B professional services for the most part, but I've shifted to different, pockets of the B2B world in doing that. That's consistently challenged me. And I've learned so much in doing so.
And I think when you're not challenging yourself, growth stops is something that people just don't take accountability. And it comes back down to no excuses. And it's something that I try and live by. But me and my partner were talking the other day, and innately as humans, we try to justify anything that we're doing. So, like a cheat meal or um, your ice cream at the end of the night or skipping the gym. It's always like, well, I had a long day. So I'm going to give this to myself, or it's okay if I don't do this because. And no excuses, I think, is something where it challenges you to think of your perspective of non justifying. It's like, okay, no, I'm choosing to not go to the gym or to not do this or not do that because I don't want to, or I don't feel I have the capacity right now. And that also opens a door of like, why don't I have the capacity? What happened today that I can try to change tomorrow so I do have the capacity? Because when you're just in that constant belief of justifying and not taking accountability and not doing the self work, there is no opportunity for growth there because there's no
Yeah.
accountability in your life. You're not, everything is out of your control at that point. And so is your
Right.
healing.
Agreed. I think far too many people want the easy button. And it's not, as you said, like you have to put the work in.
Moving into a little bit about your queer identity, you were
Mm.
married and had two children with your ex, who I'm sorry to say passed away from cancer. And you openly talk about separating from her before her second round of cancer came back and how that was the hardest choice of your life. Can
Mm.
you walk me through how you came to terms with prioritizing your own mental health and happiness for your kids when it obviously is something that you mentioned in another interview that you said felt selfish, but
Mm.
at the end of the day, you are showing your children love and respect and what you want for them too. So I think it's a very selfless thing, but can you walk me through what that was for you internally?
Yeah, it I believe is actually the single most difficult decision I've ever made. So my ex-wife and I were together for 11 years. I met her, I was 22 and she was 35. And she was not only was like, she was what I needed in that moment. And, you know, great on so many fronts. But at 22, even though exceptionally mature, I still had a lot of growing to do into whom I was and a lot of that self-love and those kinds of things. And we had there was a couple times earlier in our relationship, we took a short break-ish. And then at 9 years in, I remember like she was my best friend, but we were hardly ever even sexual anymore. And so I remember saying to a group of friends at that point, like, I think I should leave. Like I was contemplating it, but my kids were so young. And I was just like, as a family unit, we were good. And by the way, everyone saw us as the it couple. You would never have known. And she was my best friend. And we were affectionate, but not sexual. And I decided to stay for another couple of years. And my birthday rolled around. I turned 33. And I just had this moment of like kind of reflection. And I said, well, so for how much longer do I do this? I remember even having to explain it to her when I said I wanted to separate, and that I was like, I put a number on it. I said, I think I'm like 80% happy. Like if I had to explain it to you, I said, but it's like you're now just my sister or best friend and we're great co-parents. But I want more than that. And I want the children, like my thinking as well. I was like, I wanted the children to experience and see the kind of love with a romantic partner as well, and not just the friendship. And so I was like, how they were, 5 and 9 when I decided to separate. And I was the love of her life. I knew I was breaking her heart. Like it was so tough, so tough. But I was like, do I do this until they're adults? Like, how can I was just like, I can't, like, I am not fulfilled. And I had really been on this journey to like love myself, get to a better place and feel great. And the way I started to look at work and the kind of joy I wanted, it wasn't about compensation and title alone. Everything was so much more. And when I looked at meaning, so I made the decision, and I did feel selfish. I did. And, people choose sides, unfortunately, when your friends are getting separated or divorced, and no one chose mine. Right. And I was told I was being selfish. And I did start, dating like immediately. None of that was a result of like, none of it was my decision to leave her, but I broke up our family. So I lived in our matrimonial home for a number of months, and then found out, and we remained it was a roller coaster at times, but on the good times it was good. And I went with her to her oncologist appointment a few months after we separated, expecting she was going to get the official remission notice, because she'd actually completed treatment and been out of treatment for 5 years and cancer-free, only to find out it was back.
Right.
So I felt tremendous guilt. There's stress is not good for the body, period. So it was awful for me. And there were many times I questioned myself, should I go back? Like, what do I do? But I know that it was the right decision. But I still, there's still moments now I look back, and I don't know that the guilt will totally go away. Like I know I made the right choice, but my children suffered a lot for that decision. And will they learn? And I hope they will, eventually have the kind of relationship that I have now. I want that for them in their partnerships. I hope so. And I hope I showed them, what it can look like, despite the kind of the pain and the roller coaster ride they had to go through in our divorce.
I think for me, if I was looking at that, obviously as somebody that's on the outside, at the very least, they're seeing a parent prioritize their health and happiness, because at the end of the day, you could have stayed. And then if she had passed away, there never would have been that lesson of you prioritizing and saying, this isn't working to make me my best self. And I think that that's a really important lesson. So many parents try to stay together for children and make themselves miserable, and then make the children miserable. And it's not healthy to have children seeing parents that are at each other or bickering or in an unhealthy, toxic communication style, because they're learning that, they're picking up on that. And then that's also telling them what's okay for them to have in their life. So if you had stayed and if she had passed away, there never would have been that lesson for them. So I think no matter what, even I can understand why you would feel guilt, but I think it's still a really, really important, valuable lesson for them to have seen.
Yeah. I feel like they won't fully appreciate that until they're much older, though.
Yeah.
And because
that must be a shitty thing about being a parent, though. It's like, you're gonna appreciate this, just not yet.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
I will wait for the phone call when you do one day.
Yeah.
You're now married to a man. And how does it feel now being in a hetero relationship? Do you feel like you're like judged for not being queer enough? Because you hear of so many like trans people not being trans enough and gay people not being gay enough. And you're such a massive advocate for our community and you are queer. But now being in a hetero relationship, do you feel like you face a little bit of that stigma?
100%. I came out at 14 as bisexual. I vacillated on the spectrum from like at 14 saying I was bisexual, but growing up in Calgary, there wasn't a huge queer community that I saw. So I didn't really start dating women until I moved to Toronto at 20.
Right.
And then
Calgary's not known for its gay scene. Sorry, Calgary.
That's right. And so then for a number of years, I was dating women from 20 until I met my wife. And then I actually said for many, many years, no, I'm a lesbian. And then when at some point, while I was with Dee, my ex-wife, I was like, look, I look and I'm like, I appreciate beauty in people. And I'm like, actually, and that's when I went back to sort of saying that I was bisexual. I actually prefer to just say queer. I am not straight. And so, yes, now that I'm with a man and I'm usually the executive sponsor for, our Pride business or employee resource group or this and that. And yeah, it is very much, well, you're not queer enough. You're married to a man. And I'm like, nothing has changed other than the gender of my partner. And so
Totally.
I
it
feel
doesn't
like,
take away your queer identity just because you're dating a man.
right. And so I feel I need to quickly out myself now all the time. I go to we had our Holly Gay party for the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, but I brought Danny with, and so I'm meeting people, and so I'm very quick to out myself, and and I was married to a woman and whatever, and I kind of I shouldn't have to do that, but I feel the need to do that because people are kind of like, oh, why are you here? And but at the same time, I also do, and very much in the workplace perspective. So when I worked for IBM, I had spoken openly at a couple of events. I was, our local Pride ERG sponsor, and they asked me to be on IBM's webpage as one of their out executives. And there was only 30 of them globally.
Wow.
A 350,000 person organization. And initially I was like, well, why do I need to be up on the webpage, et cetera? I mean, I'm out, and I had this moment, and there was no other non-gay or lesbian. Let's just say there were no trans people, there were no bisexual people that were openly out. And so I was like, well, I'm going to be the face for that. Then, so I just so others can recognize, and as we know, it's all a spectrum. And so I'm just going to add one different color on that spectrum. Period. But yeah, I often feel like I'm questioned for not being queer enough now that I'm married to a man.
Yeah. And I feel like that's got to be really challenging. And when you talk about where you kind of fluctuated throughout my life, I had always seen myself dating cis males. And so I came out when I was 15, I think, as gay with my first boyfriend. And then when I transitioned, nothing had changed. I'd never really opened myself up to any exploring my sexuality. I was always just with cis males. And then I think when I separated from my last partner, I was just one of my core friend groups. They're majority lesbian in the friend group, and they're all just beautiful and incredible and amazing. And just when you think of the safest space you could ever be in, this is that group of women. And I was kind of going down the road of why am I not open to it? What about it is so far-fetched? And I kind of opened myself up to the possibility of going on a date with a woman to see what it would be like. And I think the reason that I was so far away from that was because of my own internalized transphobia and what that meant for me as a trans woman, and it somehow invalidating my female identity to myself, and the stigma that comes around with trans women being lesbians. And it was just, I think it was some deep-rooted internalized transphobia that I worked on. And then what happened because of that was I had never looked at my partner today, who was my best friend since we were 13, 14. I had never thought that there would be anything there with us because he was a trans man, I was a trans woman. We had both dated cis people. It was never on the table. And when I started doing self work and realizing that so much of this was based around internalized transphobia, I could really understand I had been in love with this person for a really long time. And they were not just my best friend, but somebody that I adored on so many levels, including romantically. And then that led to the happiest relationship I've ever been in my life. But again, there's like these stigmas that come down. And it's funny because on one side, it's people talking that you're not queer enough, and then you outing yourself quickly. And then the other side for me, it's like internalized and not wanting to be outed so quickly because there is validation in when you're perceived as cis for trans people. And it's really negative, but it's something that I've struggled with. And that was what dating a cis man gave to me, was that added, like, I don't even know what the right word is, a stamp of approval, I guess, from the cis community that you're a woman in a way. And it, again, really negative, completely based in transphobia. And it's something that I had to unlearn now being in a queer relationship with another queer individual. But it's the most rewarding relationship I've ever been in my entire life. Like, have never been so confident that I'm going to spend my life and build. And I know life happens, but the way that we communicate, the way that I'm treated and respected and loved and shown up for on a day-to-day basis is something I never even thought was possible.
I'm so happy for you.
Thanks. And it does help go into self-work when you feel safe. I sent him an email the other day being like, I'm really uncomfortable at times because you make me feel so safe that it's now allowing me to go inwards and do all this self-work. And because I'm safe, that's terrifying. It's scary to be safe. So
yeah, I've been trying to my younger one, Jordan, is trans male, and we've been having conversations lately, and it's a newer journey, so maybe just in the last year or so. And Jordan has just started a new job in Toronto, and we're having conversations, and he said, there's a trans woman, and he said, I told her I was an ally. And I said, Jordan, like, why did you do that? Why don't you want to create this safe space for the two of you as trans individuals? And he said he's just not comfortable, and he's passing. And so I don't have that lived experience. And so Jordan does have a number of trans friends. And so my advice was talk to some of those people. I said, because I would hope you would be openly proud and out. Yet I understand that right now it's about passing. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to coach, but again, without having that lived experience, but recommending talk to people, because I want Jordan to feel confident. I want Jordan to pass. And actually, I get pictures now. I mean, we're two different cities, and I've seen Jordan since I celebrated his 19th, birthday back in June in person. And the mustaches come in and some things like that, and that's great. But I want, and maybe I also don't want to feel like I'm projecting like and this expectation either, because I'm so openly out that he is as well. But I want him to feel proud, period. And
totally.
Not feel that he can't like identify in this case. But although I think just yesterday he did disclose to his colleague that he's trans. But it's a tough journey.
It is, and that's I think the word passing for me is such a challenging term.
His word, not mine. So
no, totally. This is just conversation. Again, it's a challenging term because passing for me is privilege to create safety, and people that aren't passing are then recognized more for being trans, which therefore puts them in more danger. And instead, passing is being used as like this trans finish line. Like, oh, once you can pass and you're perceived as that gender, then you're trans enough, then you're acceptable to the cis community because you're cis enough for them at that point in time. And so, passing to me is a toxic phrase because it sets people up for this notion that they have to pass in order to be beautiful. But for trans people, I mean, for a lot of us, like that was my mission for the first few years of my transition, was just be as feminine presenting as I could. And I lost so much about myself in that process because I was terrified to be perceived as masculine. And that's why I ended up getting my neck tattooed. I had strewn so far away from who I was on the inside. And then I was just constantly thinking about, how do I show up as business appropriate and professional? And how do I be perceived as a woman? Those were my only two thoughts. That was my entire wardrobe. That was how I did my makeup. That was every photo shoot. That was it. And I was a walking shell, constantly trying to fit into a mold that wasn't mine. And so that was where that trying to pass logic came in. But it's terrifying right now to be trans. Like, there's people literally standing up on podiums in the United States calling for a genocide against trans people. Like, there's people that are going out and murdering trans people. There's so much abuse and hate and constant social media tyrants that just try to destroy and break down trans people. I can understand why you would just want to pass and fit in and not have to have the label on your head. There's times where I've woken up where I've been like, do I just want to delete everything and go stealth and start over and not have to deal with these hateful messages and the constant bullying and harassment in social media? But then, well, what am I doing for my community and for the youth behind me? And that's
Right.
every single thing I do, including this podcast. I think about young me, and then any young queer child that is coming up, or a young adult that's going into the workforce, that what can I do to give them inspiration that it's okay to be them, it's okay to be proud to be them, and also they are entitled to the space that they take up and to own their voice. And if I go stealth, I don't get to do any of that. So, but I get it. It's a scary world right now. The world is
Yeah.
going absolutely insane.
One of the reasons why I encouraged Jordan to go back to Canada and taking a gap year before college, and early in the trans journey, I said Canada will be the place to be, not South Florida where we live. Now we're in Miami, which is a bit of a bubble in Florida, but really it's still Florida and it's the United States. So I'm like, this is the time you fully embrace and love, Canada. And not that there aren't people who are not supportive there, but in general,
Totally.
much more supportive of the community. And exactly.
Yeah. Well, I would be excited to hear about his journey and where he's at and what it feels like now, because I came out, how many years did I come out now? 6, 7? I don't even know. But coming out right now, I feel like there's such a different experience for trans people that are just coming out now and coming to terms. So maybe we'll have him on the podcast.
I'm sure he would love it. He actually says he wants to do more of this, I think getting to a better space himself, and then says when he's ready that he wants to sort of follow. I do lots of public speaking and things like that. So I think he wants to go down that path to some extent. So I'll support him any way I can.
And I love that. I think advocacy is the thing that kind of keeps me going and reminding me of why it's important to share. And then having conversations like this that I just personally find so much value in is like that little reminder to just keep going.
Yeah, agree.
I can go over so much more with you. I have so many questions, and I love learning from you. But I think we'll finish off with just something that I think is really important, and especially for any young queer entrepreneurs or any young queer individuals that are going into a workforce and starting their careers. What advice do you have for them right now if they're looking at trying to become a leader or start their own business or move up in the corporate world?
You are the CEO of your career, or if it's an entrepreneur, CEO of your organization. But by that, I mean, you chart your own course, and a little bit of that unstoppable, like, don't let anyone tell you how far or wide you can or cannot go. Like, make that decision for yourself. But you need to go back to strategic intentionality as well. Like, be strategic around what's going to take you there. And intentional around those steps. And I think a lot of people think, and a little bit more in the corporate versus entrepreneurial world, that just performing is going to get you promoted. That's important. perform, strong work ethic for sure, but you need to advocate for yourself. So build a very strong brand and a network around you of people who are going to support you, the mentors, the sponsors that are going to pull you up and recognize the potential. But own that, and don't be afraid to ask. You don't ask, get. And
Totally.
So encourage everyone to, again, advocate for themselves, be clear around where you want to get to. What do you need to get there? Don't let people stop you, and find the right people who are going to help support you get there.
Awesome. And you have 2 new pieces of advice that'll be coming out in 2024. You've got 2 books coming out. One of them is on personal branding. Is that the first one that comes out?
It is. It's going to be coming out in the middle of February.
And then you have another book coming out as well after that.
Yes, it's on leadership and what I refer to as full human leadership, and a little bit of the journey that I shared here from, Iron Maiden and the turtle and the analogy. And that one doesn't have the release date, but it'll be several months after the personal brand book.
Amazing. And we can find both of those on your website?
Absolutely. Or Amazon once they're released, but my website for sure.
Wonderful. And I will have that linked for anyone listening. Thank you so much for coming on. It's an absolute honor. I can't wait to hopefully have you on again soon, because I just have so much more that I want to dive into with you. But I'm really, really grateful. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
All right, friends, that wraps up today's episode of the BraveYard. Such a massive thank you to Victoria. She's just such an all-out, absolutely incredible human, and somebody that I'm really blessed to call a friend. I think that the way that she shows up and the inspiration that she brings and the advocacy that she brings to all of her corporate roles is so important, and she is the epitome of a boss queen. Next week, we have another amazing guest. Brock McGillis is coming on, who is the first out professional hockey player. We get into everything LGBTQ sports and advocacy, and I can't wait to share more about that soon. But for now, I'm Courtnei Lee, and you're listening to the BraveYard.